So, can a deal be reached? Here to debate, Tony Sayegh, former press aide to GOP Vice Presidential nominee Jack Kemp, and a national political correspondent for Talk Radio News Service, and former Pennsylvania Congressman Joe Sestak, a retired U.S. Navy admiral, by the way. So happy Veterans Day to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you for joining us. Now, if Congress does not act by the end of the year, $607 billion in automatic spending cuts and tax increases are scheduled to take effect starting in January. That was part of the deal last year to raise the federal debt ceiling. So is a compromise possible? Congressman Sestak, I'll begin with you.
Absolutely, it's possible, but I don't think you're going to see it until probably about the middle of February. And that's because it is possible because of two reasons. One, you have two men, Mr. Boehner and President Obama, who came very close to a grand bargain just 2 summers ago. And now you have the president, where he doesn't have another election, doesn't have to be pulled to the left, because we do have to address entitlement reform and spending cuts. And you have Mr. Boehner, head of a party that's somewhat chastised for not being moderate enough. And I think he will come again to do this principal compromise based upon what you just heard, the Simpson-Bowles outline for a bipartisan debt commission where you both have revenues raising and you have entitlement debt reform, much like Mr. Reagan did when he was president in 1982, 1984, and 1986, where he raised taxes as well as had debt reduction done by spending cuts.
So, Tony, what do you think? Is that a good starting point?
Well, look, I would agree with the Congressman. It is possible, and it's more than possible. It's essential. This fiscal cliff that we're about to go over is very real, and it doesn't benefit any American, and it doesn't benefit either political party if we go over it. You're talking about almost an instant recession, as reported by a CBO survey, occurring if nothing is done. I think the challenges for both sides, and you saw in that clip, both people are leading with the rhetoric. They're not leading with their best offer, which is negotiation 101. I get that. But Republicans have to understand the quicker we transition this conversation from defending tax cuts for the wealthy to spending cuts is really where the majority of the reform has to occur, the better off we are. You saw Frank Luntz have a poll right after the election. 35%, only 35% of Americans believe it's important to wage this kind of defense of preventing any tax cuts. I think what's more logical is to say $250,000 is way too low a threshold for a wealthy American. And I think if Republicans are able to do that, pivot the conversation to spending cuts, entitlement reform, which are the biggest drivers of our deficit, then we can actually see real progress. But I think the Congressman also indicated something that I fear. We're going to probably end up getting some stopgap measure to take us over the cliff for a little while, not real reform right away. I think we've got to be very serious about approaching this.
Well, you've only got, what, 2 or 3 weeks to reform the tax code, and is that really possible? Speaker Boehner himself said the best that we can hope for is a Band-Aid solution.
You know, Heather, and that's an important point you made. The reason I said probably mid-February is that you're able, for the month of January into about half of February, to hold off on some of these tax withdrawals that you're able to do in the Treasury Department. And take the defense cuts, for example. In the first year of defense cuts, only about 15% of what you actually appropriate is ever spent. It's paid out over 4 years. So you're able to get into about 1st February before real damage is done. But if you start going into March, Tony is spot on. You will have at minimum the first quarter have negative 0.5 GDP growth. And if you go beyond that debt ceiling mid-February, 2.8% negative reduction. In short, Tony had another important point there. The bipartisan debt commission said 2/3 of this should be done by approximately spending cut entitlement reform, because that's a large part of the budget. But about 1/3 has to be done by tax revenues. They understand what a principled bipartisan compromise is needed, must be done for the good of the American people.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that so people at home understand what we're talking about. This is the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and they also said that the current national debt exceeds 70% of the gross domestic product. They went on to say that the debt, it could shrink to about $200 billion by 2022, but to do that, we have to have those tax increases and spending cuts scheduled to take effect at the beginning of January. But then they also went on to say that in the immediate term, those moves will cause us to fall into another recession. Some analysts have even said it would be deeper, more painful than the Great Recession, and that we would not see benefits until later in the decade, maybe even beyond.
Yes.
Whereas continuing the current policies would lead to faster economic growth now, weaker economy in later years. So my question, is there an alternative to either of those approaches? What do we do?
Well, look, I think the Simpson-Bowles Commission did lay out a very reasonable framework. Unfortunately, to the Congressman's point, it's not going to happen overnight. These are much more long-term solutions. Frankly, it's a conversation that should have been happening already, but it didn't because of politics. The main issue we have to focus on right now is the fact that even though every single metric from the CBO report to an Ernst & Young study shows that maintaining all Bush tax cuts are better for the economy, particularly on growth and jobs, politics is the art of the possible. And I don't think it's possible for Republicans to think that we're going to be able to get a full extension of those cuts. So to get to the table, I think the most important thing to do is to be on the side of being reasonable about tax reform, reasonable about revenue increases, but shifting this conversation totally to spending, because that's the problem.
This conversation has to end right now, though. We will see what happens. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Heather.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Well, there is a heated